In this video, we're going to talk about some different ways to sample and why it's important to sample properly. First, there are some basic terms we need to cover. The first is population parameters. So this is some true value of a population. So if you live in the state of Florida, maybe it is all of the Florida panthers out there. So there's a few hundred of those, and this would be the average weight of the Florida panther population, or the maximum weight of the Florida panther population. Now, if you want to know what the average weight of the Florida panther population is, it's going to be very difficult for you to go find all of the panthers and to weigh all of them. It would be much easier if you could just pull a sample of the population. So let's say instead of going and finding all the hundreds of Florida panthers, you're going to go find 30, and those 30 will represent your sample. So hopefully the average weight of the sample that you pull, so that would be the sample statistic, the average weight of the sample, or the maximum weight of the sample, or the mode of the sample, ideally should be representative of what the population parameter is, so what the average weight of all Florida panthers is. This is really important because if you sample in such a way that your sample statistic is not representative of the population parameter, then all the other work that you've done beyond that point, any sort of data analysis or other experimentation, is basically worthless. It doesn't mean anything. And as a scientist, I sometimes get asked to review manuscripts of scientific studies that editors want to know whether they should be published or not. And I've actually recommended that some papers be rejected because their sampling was so biased. So they designed how they're going to do this experiment, and then they spent 3 years doing the experiment and writing it up to send it in, only to get it rejected because their sampling was so biased in the first place. So we really want to make sure that we have proper sampling whenever we conduct an experiment so that the sample statistic matches the population parameter. There are a few different types of sampling that we can implement to do this. First, we're going to talk about the types to avoid. First is voluntary sampling. Voluntary sampling is when people decide that they're going to take a survey. So maybe you go stand on a sidewalk and you ask a bunch of people to take a survey about what they think about different environmental reforms going on. Well, more than likely, people who have a really strong opinion for or against those reforms will actually stop and will take the survey. People who don't really care that much are much less likely to stop. You can see this on Yelp or other review sites as well, where people who had a really good or really bad experience are much more likely to go leave a review. So you kind of miss that middle of the road people. So you want to try to avoid voluntary sampling because of that bias. There's also convenience sampling. So convenience sampling is made up of sampling locations or sampling methodology that's just easy and convenient for you as the researcher. This can also introduce bias. So let's say that, as an example, you wanted to measure erosion in some national park, and you go pick locations to measure the erosion, and they're all on trails. Well, it's known that erosion on trails is much higher than the surrounding area. So it's going to seem like there's a lot more erosion going on in that park than there actually is just because you picked convenient locations. A sampling type that I would recommend, and that is pretty standard, is simple random sampling. This means randomly deciding where you're going to sample or who you're going to sample. In a group of people, it might be pulling names out of a hat, or it might be using some sort of random number generator to decide where you're going to go sample, or some sort of computer algorithm. It should not be you just being like, well, we'll go sample here, or we'll go sample there. That's not random. That is still introducing your bias into it. Also recommended is stratified sampling. In stratified sampling, your population is separated on characteristics, and we call these different groupings strata. So in a population, the different strata may be males and females, and you're going to go sample some of the males and some of the females, but to ensure you get both, you separate them into different strata. There's also cluster sampling is a recommended method. So in cluster sampling in environmental science, that means sampling space based on different geographic locations. So you may decide to divide Florida up by county. Each county would be a cluster, and then you go sample within each county for your cluster. And the last of the types of sampling methodology we're going to talk about is multi-stage sampling. And this really means any sort of combination of sampling methods. So it might mean doing stratified sampling and then doing simple random sampling within each strata, or likewise doing cluster sampling and then doing simple random sampling within each cluster. Now let's look at an environmental example. So this is a map of Everglades National Park. You can see here on the map, it's different colors. Each of these colors corresponds to a different habitat type. And your goal here is that you want to go collect some water quality samples, so some lake, river, maybe ocean samples throughout Everglades National Park to get an idea of what the water quality is like. With simple random sampling, one way you might do that is to print out the map, put it up on the wall, and throw darts at it. And wherever the darts land is where you're going to go sample. So that might look something like this, where we throw 7 darts at it and we find 7 locations that we're going to go sample. You may notice all of the locations here are on land essentially, and they're not hitting all the habitats. So if your goal is to get a broader scope of what's going on in Everglades National Park, we might pick a different type of sampling, such as stratified sampling. So in this example, stratified sampling would be saying, okay, we have all these different types of habitat types. We're going to go make each habitat type a cluster and then go sample within each, or make each habitat type a strata and then go sample within each strata. So that means you take one sample from mangrove forest, one sample from swamp forest, one from other forest, et cetera, until you hit all of the habitats. You can also do cluster sampling. So in this example, that would mean maybe laying a grid on top of the map to divide the park into geographical areas, and then sampling from the center of each grid. And that might look something like this, where we have all these different boxes, and we're going to go sample from the center of each of those boxes to get kind of some geospatial heterogeneity in our sampling. So in summary, the goal with sampling is so that you sample in such a way that your sample statistic, so the mean or median of your sample, is representative of what the population parameter is, so the mean or average of the population. If you don't take sampling into account, you can doom your project before it even starts. So this is very important. You don't want to gloss over this part of your project design. And there are lots of actually different sampling methods that you can use to ensure that your sample statistic matches your population parameter. I went over a few in this lecture, but there are certainly many more out there that you can explore.